The city of Vellford buzzed with its usual chaos. Honking horns, flashing signs, and endless footsteps on hot pavement. No one looked down. No one paused. Right on the edge of Crosswind Avenue, between a bus stop and a mailbox no longer used, sat a German shepherd. His name, once known by few, had faded into silence. Snoutie. His fur was matted and dull, his breathing shallow, and the black tactical collar around his neck, scorched and frayed, told stories no one cared to hear. He had been something once. Now he was nothing. Passers-by hurried past, their eyes flicking over him like he was part of the sidewalk. Some even stepped around him, wrinkling their noses or pulling their children away. Snoutie didn't move. He didn't bark, growl, or whimper. He just sat there with his head lowered, every bone in his body heavy with the weight of abandonment. He wasn't just a lost dog. He was a discarded soldier, a forgotten protector. But then came Narquisha Blimm. Tiny, no older than 4, Narquisha wore a denim jumper with red buttons and a pair of yellow clogs that squeaked softly as she stopped. She held a water bottle in one hand, her fingers curled tightly around it. Her dark eyes were locked on the dog, unblinking, as if she saw something no one else did. She didn't speak. She didn't ask. She just stared. There was no fear in her face, only quiet wonder. Her mother, Tazalin Greb, was a few steps ahead, still moving, unaware her daughter had stopped. Around them, the city pulsed and swirled, but between Narquisha and Snoutie, there was stillness. The dog slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. His body remained still, but his eyes, they flickered. A trace of recognition? A plea? No one could say, but Narquisha didn't flinch. Something inside her had already decided. She stepped forward. One foot, then another. Snoutie didn't move, but he watched her now closely. The world around them moved like a blur. But here, in this unlikely space between steel buildings and strangers, something had shifted. Something ancient and tender passed between them. It wasn't just a girl and a dog. It was a meeting of two broken pieces trying to find their way back. And no one watching knew it yet, but everything was about to change. Narquisha's small hand slowly reached out toward Snoutie. Tazalin, now realizing her daughter had fallen behind, turned just in time to see the little girl crouch in front of the battered dog. "Narquisha!" she called, urgency in her voice, but the girl didn't look back. She was focused entirely on the creature in front of her, as if she and Snoutie existed in a different time, a quieter world, untouched by honking horns or strangers' stares. Tazalin hesitated. Something about the moment felt sacred, too fragile to interrupt. Snoutie didn't growl. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and let out a low, dry exhale, almost like a sigh. His eyes blinked slowly, not in fear, but in exhaustion. He'd been ignored, pushed aside, called dangerous, and left to rot. But this child, this tiny girl with soft curls and mismatched shoes, looked at him like he mattered. She opened her water bottle and poured a little into the palm of her hand. "It's okay," she whispered. "You can have some." A few feet away, a man in a dark trench coat stood watching. His name was Zervando Lickstrap, a former officer who had once served alongside Snoutie in the elite K-9 division of the Vellford police. No one knew he was there. He hadn't intended to be, but fate or guilt had brought him to this street at this precise moment. When he saw the dog, he stopped breathing for a second. "Snoutie?" he muttered under his breath, his face draining of color. Zervando hadn't seen the dog since the day of the Westwind incident, the covert mission that left half the team wounded and Snoutie presumed dead. Rumors had swirled. Whispers about how the dog had disobeyed a direct order to protect a civilian child. No one wanted the scandal. Snoutie had been labeled defective and disposed of, but seeing him here alive shook Zervando to his core. He took a step back, heart racing, memories clawing at his chest. Meanwhile, Narquisha gently stroked Snoutie's fur. She didn't care that he was dirty or smelled like wet asphalt and sorrow. To her, he was soft, warm, and sad, and she couldn't walk away from that. Tazalin, now by her side, crouched down and touched her daughter's shoulder. "We can't keep him, baby," she said gently, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. Snoutie looked up again, this time at Tazalin, and in his tired eyes there was something eerily human, like he recognized her, or was waiting for her to remember something long buried. Later that evening, the rain began to fall gently, softening the hard edges of the city. Tazalin, against her better judgment, had allowed Narquisha to lead Snoutie into their apartment building. He walked slowly, limping slightly, every step cautious as if waiting to be yelled at or struck. The elevator ride was silent. In the dim hallway, his shadow stretched along the walls like a ghost returning to a place it didn't belong. Tazalin didn't know what she was doing. She only knew her daughter had never begged for anything like this before. Snoutie paced in slow circles in the corner of the living room, tail low, eyes constantly darting to every noise. When Narquisha reached out again, he flinched, not out of aggression, but fear. Deep, conditioned fear. It was obvious now. This dog had seen things no child should ever see, and perhaps more than most humans could endure. Tazalin exchanged a worried glance with her neighbor, Clevian Draws, who had come over with towels and a skeptical frown. "You sure about this?" Clevian whispered. "That dog's been trained for war. Look at his scars." Meanwhile, Servando Lickstrap sat alone in his studio apartment downtown, staring at an old photograph. In it, he stood proudly next to Snoutie, both younger, sharper. The mission patch on his uniform read West Wind 6. His fingers trembled as he touched the edge of the image. He knew he couldn't stay silent much longer. Not after seeing that look in Snoutie's eyes again. The same look the dog had the day he broke ranks to shield a child during the ambush. It had been a heroic act. But the department hadn't seen it that way. The truth was buried under layers of paperwork, false reports, and silence. Servando had signed those papers. He had betrayed his partner to save his own career. Now, with the past re-emerging on Crosswind Avenue, the guilt pressed down like iron chains. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Draquello Vint," he said when someone answered. "It's time. Snoutie's alive." Back at the apartment, Narquisha sat beside Snoutie, who had finally curled up on a towel. She gently hummed a lullaby her grandfather used to sing. Tazalin stood in the kitchen, conflicted. She knew they couldn't keep the dog. The building didn't allow pets. The neighbors were already whispering. And yet, something inside her had shifted. The way the dog looked at her, as if he knew her face. And in a small town just outside Vellford, an old woman named Silkersha Boomfeld looked up from her television as breaking news played on the screen. A child. A dog. Connection. Her lips parted in disbelief. It can't be. That night, while Narquisha slept curled next to Snoutie, Tazalin sat awake on the couch, staring at her laptop screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she typed in a simple search. Old K9 units Vellford Police plus German Shepherd plus Westwind. What came up made her stomach twist. Dozens of archived articles. A bombing. A child saved. A K9 dog lost in the confusion. Presumed dead. Among the black and white images, she found one that stole her breath. A uniformed officer with a strong-looking dog by his side. The caption read, "Officer Servando Lickstrap and Snoutie, K9 Unit Bravo." Her eyes widened. In another part of the city, Silkersha Boomfeld sat in her antique-filled living room, clutching a faded leather journal. Her hands trembled. The news clip she'd seen of Narquisha and the dog had awakened something she hadn't felt in years. She flipped through pages until she landed on a photo of a little boy, barely 5, with a toothy grin and a German Shepherd puppy licking his cheek. "My Frodericks," she whispered. But the real shock wasn't the boy. It was the dog. The ears. The markings. The eyes. She had seen those eyes on the screen. "That's him," she muttered. "That's Snoutie." Across town, Draquello Vint, a retired investigator, paced in his garage, digging through dusty boxes filled with files no one dared to keep. He pulled out a folder labeled Operation Iron Halo Suppressed and opened it. Inside were classified reports, one with Snoutie's ID, K9-077SX. You were never supposed to survive, he whispered to the photo. But maybe that's the point. His phone buzzed. It was Zervando. He answered but said nothing. Neither did Zervando. Just silence. Heavy and filled with regret. Back in the apartment, Tazalin watched as Snoutie began to twitch in his sleep. His paws moved rapidly, his breathing quickened, and a low whimper escaped his throat. A nightmare. Tazalin knelt beside him, gently resting her hand on his back. "You're safe now," she whispered, but her voice cracked, because deep down, she knew this dog wasn't just any stray. There was something more, something familiar, and it terrified her. The next morning, Narquisha was drawing at the kitchen table. Stick figures of a girl and a big dog with a badge on his chest. "He used to be a hero," she told her mom matter-of-factly. "He remembers stuff. I can feel it." Tazalin nodded absently, but her hands were shaking as she read yet another article. Hero K9 disobeys orders to save civilian child, disappears in aftermath. And the child in the article? The age? The name? Couldn't be, because that child's name was Tazalin Greb. Tazalin stared at the article again, her eyes scanning the paragraph that mentioned the child saved during the Westwind incident. A 4-year-old girl found hiding under debris, covered in soot, with a K9 standing guard over her body for hours. The girl had survived without a scratch. Her name had been kept anonymous at the time for protection. But one sentence chilled her to the bone. The child was later identified as the daughter of Yandris Pleaton, a public school teacher in North Vellford. That was her mother. That little girl was her. She stood slowly from the kitchen table, the newspaper article trembling in her hand. Across the room, Snoutie lay curled near the heater, his eyes half closed, but alert. "It's you," she whispered. "You saved me, and they left you behind." Memories she had long buried clawed their way back. The smell of burning wood, the flashing lights, the barking in the smoke, and then warm fur against her face, a steady heartbeat beside her as the world fell apart. She had never seen the dog's face clearly back then, but now she knew. At that very moment, Zervando Lickstrap stepped off a city bus just 2 blocks away, carrying a manila envelope under his coat. His eyes were bloodshot from a night without sleep. Inside the envelope were copies of every report he had falsified, every lie, every omission. He had tried to protect the department's image, his own future, but he had destroyed a life in the process. And now he was determined to make it right. When the doorbell rang, Snoutie bolted upright, ears perked. Narquisha looked up from her drawing, instinctively placing a hand on his back. "It's okay," she whispered. Tazalin opened the door cautiously and froze. Zervando stood there, older, worn, but unmistakable. "I need to speak with you," he said softly. "About the dog. About everything." Tazalin hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him in. Inside, Zervando knelt down, holding out the folder. Snoutie sniffed the air, then walked slowly toward him. When their eyes met, time seemed to stop. Zervando swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, old friend," he whispered. "I let them tell the world you failed. But you were the only one who did the right thing." Snoutie lowered his head gently into Zervando's lap, as if forgiving him in that single gesture. From behind the couch, Narquisha peeked out, eyes wide. "Is he gonna go away now?" she asked. Tazalin looked at her daughter, then at the 2 reunited souls before her. Her voice was low, certain. "No, sweetie. He's not going anywhere. Not this time." By the following morning, the truth had started to spread. Quietly, then quickly. Zervando had taken the first step. He walked into the Vellford News Network headquarters and handed over a sealed folder to Vrooklyn Snapjoy, an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption. "No conditions," he told her. "Just tell the story. All of it." Inside were internal memos, signed orders, altered reports, evidence that the Vellford Police Department had knowingly discarded a decorated K9 officer to avoid media scandal. The next day, the headline read, "Hero dog abandoned by department after saving child. Now found living on the streets." The story exploded online. Photos of Snoutie lying beside Narquisha, tail wagging softly, flooded social media. Comment sections filled with outrage, tears, and memories from other veterans who had served with K9 units. People were remembering. People were feeling. Something had changed. For the first time in years, Snoutie wasn't invisible. Far from the city, in a sunlit kitchen filled with houseplants and wind chimes, Narquisha Blimm stared at the screen with her hand over her heart. She hadn't left her house in nearly a year, but that morning, she got dressed with slow determination. Her connection to Snoutie went deeper than even she had admitted to herself. She had raised his mother, bred from a line of tactical K9s known for intelligence and loyalty. She had known where Snoutie was born, before he was ever assigned a badge. And now she needed to see him again, not just for closure, but for forgiveness. Back in the apartment, Snoutie sat quietly on the balcony, watching birds pass. He seemed lighter somehow, though the old scars were still there, visible and invisible. Narquisha sat beside him with a juice box, humming one of her made-up songs. Inside, Tazalin spoke softly with Servando. The department might retaliate, she warned. You're putting yourself in danger. But Servando shook his head. He protected your life. The least I can do is protect his truth. That afternoon, the doorbell rang again. When Tazalin opened it, she found an older woman with silver braids and a cane standing proudly in the hallway. I'm Narquisha Blimm, she said. I think that dog belongs to both of us. Snoutie appeared behind Tazalin, tail wagging slowly. The moment their eyes met, he froze, then whined softly, taking a single step forward. Narquisha's eyes filled with tears. You remember me, don't you, sweetheart? Inside that small apartment, generations of pain, memory, and sacrifice stood together. Survivors of different battles, all brought back together by a dog who had never stopped remembering. Narquisha sat on the floor, her cane resting beside her, as Snoutie slowly approached. There was no barking, no hesitation, just a long, quiet moment where he placed his head gently in her lap. She ran her fingers through his fur, tears slipping down her face. I held you when your eyes first opened, she whispered. I told them you were special. No one believed me, but I knew. Snoutie closed his eyes and let out a deep, peaceful sigh, as if part of him had been waiting for this reunion his entire life. Tazalin watched in silence, one hand over her mouth. Something about Narquisha's voice, the cadence, the warmth. It reminded her of her own grandmother. She hadn't expected to feel this way. She thought uncovering the truth would be the end of the story. But now she saw it was just the beginning. Snoutie hadn't come back just to be rescued. He'd come back to heal something broken in all of them. Servando stood near the kitchen counter, arms crossed, his expression heavy. He had spent years burying guilt under silence, trying to forget what he'd done. Now, in that apartment filled with quiet tears and old wounds reopening, he finally spoke. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. Not from any of you, but I need to say it anyway. I was a coward. I watched them erase him, and I didn't stop it. He looked directly at Snoutie. And I'm sorry. I should have fought for you. To everyone's surprise, Snoutie stood up and walked to Servando. For a brief second, the room held its breath. But then Snoutie leaned against the man's leg, eyes soft, tail gently thumping. Servando dropped to one knee, overwhelmed. You still trust me? He whispered. After everything? Snoutie responded with a slow lick across his hand, an answer without words. In that moment, the weight of shame began to lift. Later that evening, the three adults sat together, talking like old family members rediscovering long-lost stories. Narquisha danced around the room in circles, laughing with Snoutie chasing gently behind her. Narquisha shared tales of Snoutie's lineage, how strong and kind his bloodline had always been. Tazalin opened up about her fragmented childhood memories, how the smell of smoke still haunted her dreams, and how she now realized that the feeling of being watched all those years had never been fear. It had been protection. As night settled in and quiet fell over the apartment, Narquisha climbed into her bed with Snoutie curled at her feet. Tazalin tucked her in and kissed her forehead. "Mommy?" Narquisha murmured, half asleep. "He came back for us, didn't he?" Tazalin looked at Snoutie, then back at her daughter. "Yes," she whispered. He never stopped looking. 3 days later, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up in front of Tazalin's apartment building. Inside were 2 sharply dressed officials from the National K-9 Restoration Unit, responding to the viral outcry surrounding Snoutie's story. Their tone was polite but firm. "We're here to formally request temporary custody of K9-077SX, said one of them, Agent Frodericks Munch, handing over a folder with government seals. "For psychological evaluation, full medical treatment, and potential reintegration into a controlled support environment." Tazalin's hands trembled as she held the folder. The wording was cold, clinical. Temporary custody sounded like a lie wrapped in formality. Narquisha, standing at her side, clung to Snoutie's neck with both arms. "He doesn't want to go," she said plainly, tears already forming in her eyes. Snoutie didn't bark, but he pressed his body closer to her, sensing tension in the room. Tazalin looked at Agent Munch. "What happens if we say no?" The second agent, Clevian Draws, answered calmly. "Then the department may pursue legal action. The dog is still classified as government property. I know it sounds harsh, ma'am, but we're trying to do right by him now." Silkrisha Boomfeld, seated in the armchair, shook her head. "Now? After all these years?" Her voice cracked. "He didn't survive to be taken again. He came back to find the people who loved him. You think you can fix that with a sterile cage and clinical paperwork?" Zervando stood and faced the agents. "You want to evaluate him? Fine. But do it here, in this home, with the people he trusts." Munch exchanged glances with Draws. "That's not standard protocol," she said. "Then change the protocol," Zervando replied, his voice steady. "He earned that much." The tension was thick, but after a long pause, Agent Munch sighed and closed the folder. "We'll speak with the board. We'll need 48 hours. That night, the apartment was quiet. No laughter, no stories, just a stillness filled with dread. Tazalin sat on the floor beside Snoutie, her hand resting on his chest, feeling his slow heartbeat. "What if they take you?" she whispered. "What if I have to lose you again?" Snoutie's eyes blinked slowly, and he nudged her hand with his nose, reassuring her. He had been through worse, but even warriors have limits. In her room, Narquisha drew a picture of Snoutie with a golden cape, standing in front of a big heart. Underneath, in shaky crayon letters, she wrote, "Heroes belong where they are loved." 2 days passed like a slow-moving storm. Every knock at the door made hearts race. Tazalin tried to stay strong for Narquisha, who barely slept, keeping one hand always resting on Snoutie's back through the night. Silkrisha prepared herbal teas, trying to ease everyone's nerves, but even her steady hands were trembling. Zervando barely left his seat by the window, watching for the black SUV. Then, just after noon, it returned. This time, only one agent stepped out, Clevian Draws. She carried no folder, no badge visible. Her expression was softer, and something about her body language said she wasn't here to remove anyone. Inside the apartment, the air was tense. Snoutie stood beside Narquisha protectively. Tazalin held her daughter close, ready for a fight, but Clevian raised a hand gently. "I'm not here to take him," she said quietly. "The board reviewed the footage, the testimony, even that drawing your daughter made, and they cried." The room fell completely silent. "The decision was unanimous," Clevian continued. "Snoutie will not return to government custody. Effective immediately, he is decommissioned, fully retired, and granted honorary civilian status. He stays here, if that's what he wants." For a moment, no one moved. Then Narquisha screamed with joy, wrapping her arms around Snoutie's neck so tightly, he let out a small bark of surprise. Tazalin covered her mouth, tears slipping freely down her face. Even Zervando exhaled shakily, his body slumping with relief. Silcrisha stepped forward. So that's it? No conditions. Clevian nodded. There's just one thing, she said, reaching into her coat and pulling out a velvet box. She opened it slowly. Inside was a golden medallion, shaped like a paw print with engraved text, K9-077SX, for loyalty beyond duty. She knelt and fastened it gently onto Snoutie's collar. It's not enough, she whispered, but it's a start. As the sun set over Vellford, the apartment was filled with laughter and light. Neighbors stopped by with treats, toys, and hugs. Local reporters stood outside the building, filming from a respectful distance. Snoutie walked calmly from room to room, tail wagging, checking on everyone like he was making sure they were safe. He was no longer just a dog. He was family. He was legend. Later that night, Narquisha whispered to her mom, I think he remembers everything now. Tazlin smiled, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. So do we. Weeks passed, and the story of Snoutie faded from headlines but not from hearts. He became a quiet symbol in the community, seen on murals, classroom projects, and a new plaque installed in front of the Vellford Public Library. In honor of Snoutie, the dog who remembered what we forgot. Loyalty, courage, and unconditional love. But inside the modest apartment where it all began, life carried on. Not louder, just warmer. The kind of warmth that only comes after surviving something together. Snoutie was older now, and it showed. His steps were slower, his naps longer, but his eyes, they carried light again. He took his place as Narquisha's shadow, walking beside her to the mailbox each morning and waiting by the door when she got home from preschool. Sometimes, he'd rest his head on Tazlin's lap while she worked from home, as if quietly reminding her, you are safe now. Even Silcrisha visited every Sunday, always bringing fresh treats and stories of Snoutie's mother. He has her eyes, she'd say, wiping a tear she never apologized for. Servando came by too, not out of guilt anymore but gratitude. He had taken a position speaking to cadets about ethics and responsibility, using Snoutie's story as a lesson in honor and accountability. I buried the truth once, he told one class. But that dog? He never let it stay buried. And when he visited the apartment, Snoutie always greeted him without hesitation. No grudge, just memory. One afternoon, Narquisha brought home a drawing she made in school. A picture of Snoutie with a crown and a cape, standing between a little girl and her mom. Above it, she'd written in large, uneven letters, sometimes heroes don't talk, they just stay. Tazlin pinned it to the fridge and left it there. Not just because it was cute, but because it was true. That silent presence, unshaken, unjudging, had rebuilt a broken part of her life she never thought could be whole again. And when the time eventually came, because time always comes, Snoutie passed quietly in his sleep, curled at the foot of Narquisha's bed. The family mourned, but not in devastation. They mourned with gratitude. He hadn't died forgotten or alone. He had been loved, remembered, and finally understood. That night, Tazlin whispered to her daughter, we gave him peace. Narquisha whispered back, and he gave it right back to us. Because sometimes the most powerful goodbyes are the ones where nothing has to be said.